Old Zino by Lucy Zane, abridged version, based on a true story, for all my children. Part 1, Chapter 1, Canyons of the High Plains. The sunset glowed orange and brown and dark yellow off the walls as Joe made his way to the large natural monolithic stone in the middle of the narrow box canyon. 400 feet of broken vertical sand rock at its deepest, Chilcoot Canyon sprawled for several miles of true natural beauty. A beautiful rocky canyon that few have ever seen, isolated on the high plains of southeastern Colorado. An Australian might call it the American outback. It is a place city people often called the Sticks. The boulder stood 15 feet high, about 30 feet long, and 25 feet thick. Along the south side of the roughly rectangular stone, a simple wall of sandstone rocks had been built up to form two walls. The rocks held together with adobe mud. The top of this simple dwelling bristled with twisted, weathered juniper logs as roof beams, covered with some rusted corrugated tin. The tin lay unattached, held down with many square chunks of sandstone. The packed-down dirt floor supported handmade rustic furniture. A dilapidated outhouse stood 30 feet from the one door. The door had two large barn hinges and consisted of many small juniper tree branches, bound together with woven baling wire. This had long been old Zino's home. He had built it himself in about 1899. The current year was 1948. A cowboy in his 20s sauntered along the cow trail beside a thin creek. He ignored the occasional rattlesnake hanging out on short shelves of cracked sandstone strata, inches from his pointed leather cowboy boots. Joe walked up the dusty creek bank and nodded to an ancient-looking man, standing stooped in the doorway of his lean-to home, built against the boulder. He wore a stained, creased felt cowboy hat with holes in the creases. Over his thin, small, hunched shoulders, he wore a thin, bare poncho, stained canvas shirt, and canvas pants. He stood barefoot in the doorway, his weather-beaten, crinkled brown skin gathered around his dark, deep-set eyes. "Hola! ¿Qué pasa, Joe?" he greeted as Joe stopped in front of him. Joe shook the old man's hand and replied, "Hello, Zino. Muy bien, my friend. It's Saturday night, and guess what I've brought? Tequila." The old man's face brightened, and he waved the young man into his hut. "Oh, you are muy bienvenido. Step in me comer, my friend. I have mutton stew. Come here with me," he enthused. His English was broken and peppered with Spanish words. They ate dinner and drank tequila. After several drinks, Joe became more conversational. "I got the tequila in Trinidad last Saturday night. You know, I mostly only drink Jim Beam. But that kid Henry James was with me, and he wanted tequila. So I bought 2 bottles. Hey, Zino, you will never believe this one kind of tequila I saw on the shelf." Zino finished chewing a tough chunk of mutton with his few remaining teeth and replied, "Was clear as water? I have seen the clear tequila before. Very smooth, I am told. Never tried it." "Nah, it wasn't clear. But there was a worm at the bottom of the bottle. Isn't that crazy? The label said the worm showed it was the finest tequila and were not to buy any tequila with a live worm, meaning it was too low in alcohol to kill the worm, I guess." Old Zino rolled his eyes slightly and said, "A new gringo thing, I think. Made in America, must be. I never heard of no such thing. Look, Joe, the only worm around tequila eats on agave azure, you say blue agave, plants that make the tequila. That means the tequila made of bad plants. Worse tequila. No es bueno." "Well, okay, then. Good to know. I'll never buy that crap, then," Joe assured Zino. Then Joe told Zino about nearly getting in a gunfight in Trinidad, Colorado, that weekend before. He mentioned it matter-of-factly, patting the butt of his long pistol in the holster at his side. Zino's face fell, and he looked away as Joe told him about it. "Hey, Zino, what's the matter? You wouldn't fault me for shooting a fool who was drawn down on me, would you?" the younger man inquired, incredulous. Zino took a long pull on the tequila bottle and then slowly set it down on the table. He turned his head and looked into Joe's face solemnly. He stared for a long time until Joe felt embarrassed and looked away. When Zino spoke again, it was in his native Spanish, and slowly so Joe might understand. Tehe contada alguna vez camo es rinde a vir aquí cuidando ovejas un usta pinquia cañón hace 40 años pregunto un voz baja. Did I ever tell you how I came to live here tending sheep in this little canyon 40 years ago? He asked quietly. Joe struggled through the Spanish words and then thought about it for a while before he replied, No sé por qué. No, Zino, I've never really thought about it before, but now that you mention it, how did you end up here all by yourself at the bottom of a canyon in the middle of nowhere? Old Zino's face sagged as he leaned over the table, supporting himself on both elbows. His hands clasped together. I killed a man. Joe's eyes went up with surprise as he replied, Well, I've known you for over 12 years. If you killed a man, I'm sure you had a good reason. I know you wouldn't rob anybody. You wouldn't hurt anybody, and you sure wouldn't kill nobody in cold blood. You must have had a good reason, right? Zino drank again and said, See, that is what I used to always say to myself. It doesn't matter. Just don't you ever do it, Joe. Don't you ever kill a man, no matter what happens. Don't kill him, even if he needs it. You will regret. Te arrepentirás. Te haga esta promesa. Te arrepentirás. What happened, Zino? Joe asked quietly with deep concern in his voice. I was a young man then, like you. Full of life, full of fight. Lots of dreams I had. Old Zino began in his broken English. My little homestead was on top of a mesa tableland, way south of here. What you blancos call New Mexico now. And I was 22 years of age. I had sheep, I'd built a little cabin. Life was good. Then a rich blanco bought all the land around and below my mesa. He was kind to me and we got along all right. But his youngest son was no good. He would ride his horse up to my mesa. He would cut my fences and tear up my cabin. Whenever he saw me, he would ride by and yell, Now you get out of here, greaseball. We don't want your kind here, and other such estúpido threats. I stood my ground and made it clear that I would defend my homestead. That little cabron came and harassed me a lot for almost a year. Finally, he rode up to me and nearly knocked me down while I was repairing my fence. He had his rifle out and started shouting at me. Looky here, you stupid fool. I'm done playing with you, see? This here's our land. It's all part of the same ranch that we own. If I find you up this mesa again, the next time I see you, I'm going to kill you. Do you understand me, Mr. Mexicano? In fear, I agreed that I did, but told him that I legally owned the land and would not be going anywhere. I started carrying my 2 pistolas loaded in my saddlebags at all times. The next week the brat returned. I had just saddled my horse and was about to get up in the saddle when I heard the sharp click of a rifle being cocked to shoot. Without thinking, I reached both my hands into my saddlebags, pulled out my 2 pistolas, whirled, and shot him through the chest. He fell from his horse, his rifle in his hand, without making a sound. He was dead before he hit the ground. Joe wagged his head and said, Well, that was clearly just plain old self-defense, Zino. You did the right thing, I'd say, and I'd think anybody would say that. Old Zino shook his head slowly. It does not matter. Now I regret. Now I wish I'd never shot him. Did they blame you? Did the guy's dad have you charged with murder? Joe asked. Zino continued. What happened is that I became very afraid. I was sure the boy's dad would string me up as soon as he and his cowhands got me. Or at the least, he would have the marshal arrest me for murder. I was sure they would never believe I shot in defense. So I packed up my horse that afternoon and ran. I rode for days into the wilds of the norte, always looking over my shoulder for the dust of those who would be after me. I rode up here into El Colorado, into these canyons. I hid out and barely survived for years. One day, I was so hungry, I revealed myself to a white man and his family who had just moved here to Homestead. His name was James Stroke." Joe interrupted. "What year was that?" "Oh, I started working for that man in 1902. I believe that was the year. I did not keep very close watch on the años in those days. Eventually I was overcome with homesickness and loneliness. I traveled back to that place in New Mexico. I found some of my family there. They were surprised that I still lived. 'You should have never left,' they said. 'The marshal ruled the shooting in complete self-defense the next day.' That was the day I knew myself for a fool. That was the day I fully realized the madness of my fear. I will always regret shooting that young man. Self-defense, it does not matter." Big tears dropped down his craggy face and dripped onto the table. Old Zino stumbled off to bed, and Joe could hear his soft keening into the blankets. Joe thought it over for a while. "Maybe I'll stop carrying my pistol with me,"